Tonight, the unspeakable pain of France's Pelicot family. Gisele Pelicot's son, David, tells Sky News how he now views the man whose mass rape crimes shocked the world.
He was my father, but he's not anymore. Today, he's a monster.
And the family's hope after witnessing the darker side of humanity. Also ahead, the president, his arrested rival, and the protests rocking Turkey. Could things escalate into a real crisis for Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who has ruled and reshaped Turkey over more than 20 years? The UN refugee chief tells me how vulnerable lives are being put at even greater risk by foreign aid cuts, calling it a perfect storm.
On the one hand, price is increasing, and on the other, funding that is necessary to respond, to support the humanitarian system, decreasing.
Plus, US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth in the spotlight after a journalist says he was included in texts about military strikes in Yemen. And an exploration of oppression in the country referred to as Europe's last dictatorship. All that coming up in The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. To people across France and the world, Gisele Pelicot is a hero, a survivor of horrific crimes committed by the man she once called her husband. Dominique Pelicot admitted to repeatedly drugging and raping Gisele for years and inviting dozens of other men to do the same. Tonight, their son David tells Sky News of the unspeakable pain inflicted by Dominique, who he says is no longer his father, but a monster. David spoke to our Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins, starting with how his mother told him what happened. Have a listen.
It's a moment that will remain etched in my memory forever. So, on the 2nd of November, 2020, around 8:15 p.m., I was in the kitchen with my wife and children. The phone rings. I pick up the phone and it's my mum, who tells me that I have to go somewhere quiet and alone because what she's going to tell me is so unbelievable that I should be alone. And what she told me was like a tsunami, that she was abused by many men that Dominique Pelicot, her ex-husband, had invited to rape her. I felt so many emotions rising within me, and then the nausea, which had been mounting during the entire conversation, reached a peak. I hung up the phone, and it felt like the floor gave away under my feet, and I felt sick. I went to the bathroom and threw up.
The scale of abuse uncovered was mind-blowing, not just from your father, but the fact that he invited other men to rape your mother as well. How did you as a son, as the oldest son, process that?
The moment we were told that she had been abused by more than 50 men, it was very difficult to hear. This man, Dominique Pelicot, was, for me, the backbone of the family. He had taught me to respect women. And so, when I heard what he had done to our own mother, as the eldest son, I was filled with anger and total incomprehension. It's like we had left reality behind. We had gone from having a normal family life to one that had been completely erased. He was my father, but he's not anymore. Today, he's a monster.
You call your father a monster. How do you see your mother?
First and foremost, she's our mum. She's also our children's grandmother. But today, and for the rest of her life, she will be a heroine. A family's life was completely destroyed, but thanks to Gisele Pelicot, She lifted the veil on chemical submission, so we were extremely proud throughout the trial.
Fiers tout au long de ce procès.
Your sister is looking at her own allegations of abuse against her. How do you feel about your father's consistent denial about what she fears he did to her?
Moi, je partage le sentiment que Caroline...
I believe that Caroline was abused by Gisele Pelicot. I say today, and I repeat, that I will be by her side in this fight.
Dans ce combat.
So much loss and hurt and damage to your whole family. How do you move forward? Can you ever heal from that?
Maman essaye de se reconstruire.
Mum is trying to rebuild herself, little by little. We have endured such unspeakable pain throughout this trial. But we must continue to live, give meaning to our lives, and not forget that in the world there are other women who cannot speak and who absolutely must be helped.
Qu'il faut absolument aider.
Have you heard from Dominique since he's been sentenced? Has he tried to contact you?
Alors, je vais vous faire une confidence, il nous a écrit...
I'll tell you a secret. He wrote to me before the trial.
Je me suis posé...
But the first thing I asked myself was, why is he writing to me? Is he writing to apologize, to ask for forgiveness, or to try to manipulate me?
Ou pour essayer de manipuler.
So I read his letter carefully, but quite honestly, I tore it up and I threw it in the bin. He was asking for forgiveness, but forgiveness? Personally, I will never forgive him.
Personnellement, jamais je pourrais pardonner.
What's your message to Dominique Pelicot, though? If you could speak to him now, what would you say to him?
Why? Pourquoi?
Do you think he'll ever tell you why?
Non, je ne pense pas.
No, I don't think so. I have no doubt he'll die in prison, and rightly so. But I'm convinced that he'll take many of his secrets to the grave.
So much darkness and evil was exposed in this trial. Is there any light that can come from it?
Mais dehors, on avait une foule immense de...
Outside the court, huge crowds of women cried with joy at the announcement of the verdict. It gave immense hope to all women who suffer sexual violence. So we must keep in mind that there was not only bad that came from this, there was also a lot of positivity, and that today, people are free to speak out.
Positif, c'est que la parole aujourd'hui se libère.
That was David Pelicot there speaking to our Siobhan Robbins. And Siobhan joins me now. I mean, you know, I have to almost take a moment and just, you know, process this. Siobhan, I've seen this interview a number of times, but you know, it's so heavy and so powerful what he's saying, but also it's hard to sort of process what this family's actually been through.
I think that's exactly right. When I was thinking about what stayed with me from that interview, it's both extraordinary but totally heartbreaking. And I think the things when he spoke to me that really stuck with me is that idea that Gisele Pelicot in 2020 went into a police station believing that she was going to hear from the police potentially about her husband being caught trying to film up women's skirts. Instead, they brought her into a room and began showing her the most horrendous images of her being raped, and her husband, who she had been married to for almost 50 years, being accused of drugging and raping her and allowing other men to do the same. And then having that same day, when she's basically processing this horrendous crime, these horrific images, having to pick up the phone to her children and somehow break that news to them. And you heard from David's interview, his reaction to that. I think the other thing that's really stuck with me is, as you say, how he's processing it. So you heard in the interview, I refer to Dominique as his father, his dad. He never says that. He always calls him Dominique Pelicot. And I think
he said to me that he's done that because this is his way of grieving, of moving on, of trying to separate the life that he believed. And I think this is the other thing, this life he lived for 45, 46 years, this family he believed in, this father, loving father he believed in, he suddenly found out was a total lie. And how do you rebuild that? How do you rebuild who you are, what your family is, your place in the world? It's just utterly heartbreaking.
Yeah, and I think for me as well, Siobhan, what really stood out was that he kept referring to his father, not as my father, but as Dominique Pelicot, almost trying to remove him from himself, and sort of trying to process, as you say, this life that he once knew turned on its head, getting that phone call from his mother, and how extraordinary his mother is, but also explaining to you, saying, that's my mother, she's also the grandmother to my children, but she's this extraordinary hero now because of what she has gone through and how she's processed this. I mean, I just thought the entire thing was so incredibly powerful, the way that you were able to draw that out of him.
I think just like his mother, David Pelicot is extremely dignified. And don't forget that he's had 4 years to try and put this horrific information in some sort of place and then had to sort of relive it all through this trial. And I don't think any of us should forget how horrendous an offender Dominique Pelicot was. There was no day that was off limits for him to abuse his wife. She was raped and abused on Valentine's Day, on New Year's Eve, on her birthday, and her children have had to live through that. And they've lost their father, who, as you heard David say, he now sees as a monster. But the image of their mother has also changed because she, around the world, for many people, is now seen as a hero. And so they have to balance that. They have to balance that their world, her world as well, has imploded. And then they have to kind of re-find who they are in this new existence.
Yeah, it's really quite something. Siobhan, thank you so much for all of your reporting there. Well, let's go to the rest of the day's news and, of course, to Turkey now, where President Recep Tayyip Erdogan warned today of what he described as a movement of violence in the biggest protest the country has seen in more than a decade. It could hint at a wider crackdown by the man who has dominated Turkish politics for more than 2 decades and faces no immediate tests at the ballot box. But rivals have emerged. And this is the 6th night of demonstrations since Istanbul's mayor, seen as a major challenger in the next presidential race, was arrested. Ekrem İmamoğlu, who denies wrongdoing, insists corruption and other charges are made up. The government and President Erdogan say the courts and justice are independent. Have a listen.
I have made this call several times before, and today I am repeating it. Stop disturbing our citizens' peace with provocations. If you have the courage, account for the corruption, theft, bribes taken and irregularities committed.
Well, our special correspondent Alex Crawford has been among part of the protests that became heated in Istanbul tonight.
You can see, talking to a number of the people here, they're talking about fears that there has been an erosion in their democracy, that there's sudden arrest of an elected official along with many others, as well as more than 1,000 other arrests, including a number of journalists, as well as civil servants and municipal officials, staff of the Istanbul mayor. They believe is an erosion of democracy, and it comes at a time when Turkey is suffering from very high inflation, a very difficult economic situation here. The Turkish lira has plummeted, and a lot of people are frankly feeling the pain of high inflation and trouble with getting jobs. Every night for the past 5 nights or so, there has been pretty much pitched battles between the police and the demonstrators, and it looks as though tonight is not going to be any different, but the authorities have warned they will not put up with this. And if they believe that there is civil disorder, they're going to break it up. You can already smell the pepper spray in the air, and you can see a number of tear gas or pepper spray has already been fired, and they have been also using rubber bullets. There's obviously been a push by the police to break up this demonstration, everyone moving fast, and the police firing what appears to be pepper spray, possibly rubber bullets as well, but a big movement of people now to get out of the way. The police are making a definite move to push everyone out of the way and firing pepper spray. They've said all along that they're not going to put up with civil disorder, and they're making sure that people clear this area. The police had warned, the president himself had warned that they were not going to put up with any civil disorder. And quite soon after the speeches had completed, the police moved forward, no messing around, firing rubber bullets, pepper spray. You can see ambulances now. A lot of people running in panic, quite frankly. A lot of disorder, and they're continuing to fire. If you look over there, they're continuing to fire what looks like rubber bullets as the protesters are throwing projectiles back in their direction. Come on, Jake, come on. Everyone's running now, and they are firing rubber bullets at us, pellets.
Go on.
Where's Jake?
Get out, they're still shooting. Everybody okay?
A lot of chaos, and everyone moving very quickly, which obviously is exactly what the police want. A lot of the young people we spoke to today feeling very unhappy, and they're still firing even as people are running. They don't want people to be gathering. This is quite different to the tactics that we've seen earlier in the previous nights, because the police were quite happy to let them sit there for many hours, but today, different. They decided they weren't going to put up with it any longer, and I think they got that message from President Erdogan.
Extraordinary scenes there in Istanbul. Well, President Erdogan has dominated Turkish politics for more than 25 years. His first major step was in 1994 when he was elected mayor of Istanbul with the pro-Islamic Welfare Party. That came to an end in 1997 when Mr. Erdogan was jailed for 4 months, convicted of inciting racial hatred for publicly reading a nationalist poem. He returned to politics in 2001, forming the Conservative Justice and Development Party, or AKP, which won parliamentary elections the following year. From 2003, Mr. Erdogan would serve 3 terms as Prime Minister. Supporters praised reforms, while critics warned of an authoritarian streak. His government was accused of using excessive force against protests in 2013, which began over development plans in Istanbul. Unable to run for Prime Minister again the following year, Mr. Erdogan won Turkey's first presidential election held by direct vote. The role then was largely ceremonial. He survived a military coup attempt in 2016 and embarked on a large-scale campaign of arrests, not just in the army, but thousands of perceived plotters, including teachers and journalists. In 2017, he narrowly won a referendum that transformed Turkey into an executive presidential system and became the first president with executive powers in elections the following year. Well, joining me now is journalist and author of Turkey, Everything You Need to Know, Andrew Finkel. He interviewed President Erdogan at the start of his political career. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us here on the programme. In many ways, there is a sense of déjà vu. I mean, just looking at Alex Crawford in the streets of Istanbul, I remember very similar scenes, as we're saying, about a decade ago. And then, of course, when the coup happened, he was rounding up thousands of teachers and journalists every single night for their support of what he believed was, the Gulenist. And now, of course, this mayor that's in prison, and he's rounding up protesters on the streets again.
Well, yes, as you say, there's been an incremental increase in the authoritarian stance of the president, and your chronicle, your timeline seemed to sum it up very well. In 2013, there was this environmental protest and occupation of the center of Istanbul, Taksim Square, a very emblematic, symbolic place in the city where, you know, a focus of people's attention. That demonstration was allowed to exist for a couple of days, for a little while, and then they were fairly ruthless in clearing out the square, much in the way that you saw them clearing out the square this evening. That event really was a signal. The following year, Freedom House, the New York-based human rights group, downgraded Turkey from being partly free to not free, and the Turkish press to being not a free press. And of course, we saw journalists being, in those days, just dismissed. But after the 2016 attempted coup, there was really a wide-scale arrest of journalists. Maybe 150, 200 were put into jail. Press organs were shut down. And ordinary people, teachers, as you said, civil servants, people who were suspected of having allegiances with this Gulenist movement, this rival religious faction, were put into jail or dismissed from their jobs. So,
yeah, I mean, we have over the years seen President Erdogan really round up, you know, political rivals at different twists and turns. Certainly for Imamoglu, he's been at it, you know, battling the courts for years.
Well, what happened in 2019 was that there was a local election, and Ekrem İmamoğlu won that election by a very narrow margin. Obviously they thought they could resit that election and win. The election was annulled by the higher election board, but in fact, İmamoğlu came out even with an even stronger performance. And his press statement that the higher electoral board had behaved idiotically was seen as an insult to an institution of the Turkish state, and he has been put on trial and convicted for having insulted this organ of the state. And of course, he's faced even greater difficulties now. He's accused of corruption, peculation, of bid rigging, and also of terrorism charges, which the court hasn't actually brought those charges. They said there's no need to. He's been arrested for other reasons, but these charges are on the back shelf, as it were. Basically, what they're not. Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's interesting here is a number of things. First of all, you know, anyone who has tried to challenge President Erdogan over the years, he has attempted to crush, including dissent. And then, of course, separately to that, he has continued to hold elections and, you know, try to sort of show that they are on some level, you know, free, the elections that Turkey has had. And then the third element, of course, is Turkey's positioning in terms of how much Europe needs Turkey and, you know, how much the United States might need Turkey in terms of security for Europe, for Ukraine, for example, and peacekeeping forces going forward. So it is positioned itself in quite an interesting way. And while questions should be asked about President Erdogan's conduct, but is it necessarily at this stage?
Well, what you've described is what some social scientists call a sort of, competitive authoritarian system, whereby you have elections which are free, but they're not fair. And they're not fair in the sense that the government controls, some say 90, some say 95% of the media. So it's very difficult for opposition voices to get through. And some opposition voices that do get through are apprehended, arrested. We've had a throttling of Twitter and of all the social media this week. And with the cooperation of X, various accounts have been banned in Turkey. Opposition accounts have been banned. So there is this desire to control Turkey through authoritarian measures and yet portray the country as free. So we have the justice minister saying there's nothing wrong with these trials. He's guilty of this corruption charges. Why shouldn't the courts, which are free and fair, why shouldn't they be allowed to go ahead and prosecute what they see to be a breaking of the law? And as you also said, the international climate would seem to be sympathetic to Turkey's voice. There's Turkey, Erdogan, who has sort of invented what they call, instrumental transactional politics well before other autocrats used them. Turkey, when he came to very early on in his term, Turkey was a candidate to join the European Union, but of course nowadays it would hardly get a seat at a concourse of nations which believe in democratic principles.
Yeah. I absolutely fascinating talking to you, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure.
You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still to come on the programme. We'll tell you how it seems Donald Trump's team accidentally texted their plans for military strikes to a journalist.
We've come to one of Moscow's Cold War bunkers. It was built as a top-secret command centre. Being here really feels like you're stepping back in time. I'm Ivor Bennett, Sky's Moscow correspondent. A show of military might and menace. Courage, bravery and sacrifice will win the day. It's a new subject. They'll learn about combat drones and some how to handle a Kalashnikov. The Kremlin continues to put forward its own version of events, both present and past.
There's no mention of the fact that Russia invaded its neighbour. That's rewriting history, isn't it?
Now we have to read it carefully.
Vladimir Putin put forward his plan for a ceasefire in Ukraine, telling Kiev, pull out of your eastern territories and the war will end. Why should the West trust you?
Frankly, I don't care whether the West trusts us or not.
Vladimir Putin is already the Kremlin's longest-serving leader since Stalin. The question is, what will a fifth Putin term mean for Russia and the world? Why do you support Vladimir Putin, Mr. Segal?
I can't answer questions that stupid.
I've watched Vladimir Putin attempt to create a new world order. The St. Petersburg Economic Forum was the backdrop to Vladimir Putin's latest verbal volley that Russia could send missiles to other nations to target the West. Ambassador, I wonder, shall we have a quick word for Sky News? Is the West right? Are you fueling Russia's war machine?
Swedish media, oh my God, you're not afraid of being here.
American journalist Evan Gershkovich is on trial here, who was first on display. Russia says Evan Gershkovich was caught red-handed, but has never produced any evidence to back that up. Sky News. Get the full story first.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
We're rolling.
Welcome to the world.
Our new podcast, starting now. It's very exciting. Every week we'll be reporting from the world's trouble spots.
We get to hold those in positions of power accountable, and we get to ask the questions that the audience, the listeners, want to know about.
And that's why it is so important that people tune in, come along for the road, come along for the journey. It'll be fun.
Welcome back. Well, when we talk about the Trump administration, we're often left wondering what really goes on behind closed doors. But one journalist says he found himself in the middle of the conversation. Jeffrey Goldberg, editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, claims the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth accidentally added him to a group chat about highly classified plans to strike Houthi targets in Yemen. Well, let's get more on this now from our correspondent David Blevins. David, this story is just so wild. When I first saw it, I was trying to sort of process exactly what had happened. And then I read a little bit about, Jeffrey Goldberg's account of how he was added into this Signal conversation. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. The vice president commenting, the national security advisor commenting, Pete Hegseth commenting, and then he left the group. I mean, the whole thing is just wild.
Yes, and the sensitivity of it is extraordinary, sensitive enough for Jeff Goldberg, the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, to write, "I didn't think it could be real," and then the bombs started falling. He simply couldn't believe, Yalda, that he'd been inadvertently added to this group chat on the Signal messaging app among names like J.D. Vance, the vice president, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, and Mike Waltz, the national security advisor. And they were discussing impending strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen and discussing it in great detail, the potential targets, the weapons to be used, the sequencing, etc. Now, the White House has confirmed the veracity of the group and says it's investigating how a journalist was inadvertently added, but this raises huge questions. Remember how often Donald Trump, as both candidate and president, called for Hillary Clinton to be jailed for using a private email server when she was US Secretary of State. So there are huge questions tonight about the extent to which national security in the United States has been jeopardized and about whether using this kind of platform for such a sensitive conversation actually violated the Espionage Act, because it's a staggering breach of national security.
Absolutely. I mean, as you say, to the point where Jeffrey Goldberg, a journalist, decided to exit the group himself because he felt he was being exposed to sort of information that he shouldn't have been. And he's chosen not to publish any of the information because he says, apart from the detail of going in the group and some of the conversation, but not the actual details of the operation and the plans, because he said that would risk national security.
Yes, disbelief on his part, and there is now disbelief on Capitol Hill as well. One Democratic congressman who's an Army veteran described it as FUBAR, which I'm told is an old military acronym for effed up beyond all recognition. Another member of Congress described it as amateur hour, because I suppose, Yalda, beyond the security implications, what this group chat has given us is an insight into the thinking of the Trump inner circle. And really, we find out an awful lot because the screenshots tell us that J.D. Vance, the vice president, appears to be questioning the decision of the president to launch these strikes. Yet again, the vice president reveals his true feelings about Europe, posting, "I hate bailing Europe out again," because, of course, the US administration believe that protecting shipping lanes in the Red Sea, often targeted by the Houthis, that benefits Europe more than it benefits America. In fact, Hegseth went on to describe European allies as freeloaders and pathetic. And I think most striking of all, of course, is the use of emojis in this conversation. Praying hands before the strikes were launched, and then the use of the American flag and a fist bump and a fire, celebrating the strikes afterwards. That sort of use of emojis in such a sensitive conversation about a strike on America's enemies is going to leave a lot of people on Capitol Hill very uncomfortable.
Yeah, indeed. David, thank you so much. Now you're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, a perfect storm. The UN refugee chief tells me the global impact of aid budget cuts as crises worsen.
Sky News get the full story first.
Is this now all your territory?
Yeah. The battlefield is outside the barricades. We are in the middle of a forest, in a jungle really, and they're attempting to keep these men alive. I'm Stuart Ramsey, and I'm Sky's chief correspondent. It's really dangerous. Many people have died riding it.
Welcome back. They're some of his most forthright comments yet since US President Donald Trump's deep cuts to US foreign aid programs. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, has told me agencies and NGOs like his are in a perfect storm running out of money as crises worsen. I spoke to him earlier. Have a listen.
Things are different, but at the same time, and dramatically so, things are the same in the sense that we do have millions of people on the move. I speak now from the perspective of my organization, which means that there are this crisis upon crisis erupting all over the world. So the needs are there. If anything, the needs are growing. But we are in a situation in which many donors are reducing, for different reasons, their humanitarian and development assistance. So in a way, it's a perfect storm, isn't it? On the one hand, price is increasing, and on the other, funding that is necessary to respond, to support the humanitarian system, decreasing. This has happened before, but I have never seen it in more than 40 years of work, of humanitarian work, at this huge scale.
How are you dealing with it? Because as you say, I mean, you know, regardless of whether conflict has more or less, ended in a place like Syria, I mean, it hasn't. But the fact is that we're not dealing with the same sort of bloodshed, but we are seeing huge humanitarian needs there. There are conflicts raging across the globe. There is millions of people moving, and yet you are now facing this massive challenge.
Well, the humanitarian system is pretty elastic. Since it is largely funded voluntarily by donors, by states, by private donors, it has to have the ability of expanding and contracting, and it has always done it. And many times contractions are actually moments in which you take advantage of that moment to become more efficient, to eliminate any kind of duplication or waste. So we are using that moment once again, all of us in the system, but the cuts are so deep, or may be so deep, we don't know yet, and there's so much uncertainty that even this rationalization, if you want to call it like this, is more difficult than usual. We'll do it. We're all engaged. We're trying to do our best with the smaller resources that we have, but this is also a retreat in many places where we're needed.
As you say, everyone is focusing on the Trump administration's freeze and aid cuts. But actually, even here in the UK, we've seen foreign aid be impacted because of a focus on defence spending. Do you think when nations do that, because there is a need to up defence spending, there is that pressure, given the state of where Europe and the world is at right now, I guess the question is, should foreign aid be the thing that is sacrificed?
Obviously, you know that I will say no. It shouldn't be sacrificed. And not only because foreign aid humanitarian aid and then, of course, development saves and improves lives all over the world. And so there is a moral imperative behind that, but also because aid is a great stabilizer. I've seen it. I've been in aid work for more than 4 decades. I've seen it over and over again. When aid declines, is withdrawn, goes away, more instability prevails. More, all countries are so worried about irregular movements of people. Well, if you don't help people closer to the crisis, they'll move on. This is what we are already seeing in places like Chad. at other countries neighboring Sudan because of the refugees coming from Sudan. They don't find assistance or enough assistance. They move on trying to get assistance elsewhere. So cutting aid is actually very destabilizing, and ultimately it causes insecurity. So I would say that much as Europe is stepping up defense spending to compensate for the decrease in the US security umbrella, the same thinking should apply to aid. The US has provided a huge aid umbrella for many decades. Time has come to share that burden more.
Filippo, I know that the situation in Gaza doesn't fall under your umbrella, but we've also now seen a fragile ceasefire collapse there and the humanitarian crisis there go from already a devastating situation to unbearable for so many people who are stuck there, who don't have access to aid. And of course, the hostages, many of them still remain in Gaza. And we've seen the death toll reach 50,000 now. So many women, children, innocent people killed in that conflict.
Yeah, as you said, my organization is now involved in the Gaza response, in the Palestine response. But here I want to share what the UN Secretary General and many of my colleagues have already said. It's very important to go back to the dynamics that did eventually and finally produce a ceasefire just a few weeks ago. So release of hostages on one hand and ending the terrible destruction of Gaza and the loss of Palestinian lives on the other. It's very, very important that that ends. And like I said, we're not involved, but if you take a step back, you also notice another important thing that I've been saying a lot these days. And this concerns, once again, Europe. If you start from Ukraine, you go through the Caucasus, the Middle East, Gaza, Lebanon, Yemen, then you have Sudan, and then you have the whole of West Africa that is very fragile with a lot of conflicts causing displacement. Europe today is surrounded by a belt of crises. If at least the humanitarian consequences of those crises are not dealt with adequate resources, including European resources, I tell you, states in Europe that are always so almost obsessively worried about the arrival of refugees, of people on the move, that phenomenon will grow. I've never used this argument to scare people. I thought it was inappropriate to do it, but now it's a reality that is going to grow.
That was Filippo Grandi there. Well, this is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up on the programme, raising awareness of the brutality of the Belarusian regime. We'll hear from the director of a new film detailing the government's crackdown on dissent.
Hello, I'm Anna Botting. Coming up on Sky News at 10, our exclusive interview with the son of rape survivor Gisele Pelicot. Questions for Heathrow's boss over last week's power outage, and a look ahead to Wednesday's spring statement from the Chancellor. Those stories and more at 10.
The Chancellor is looking for ways to promote growth.
Today, I want to talk about economic growth.
What plans will Rachel Reeves forecast for this spring?
Our growth prospects.
And will they bloom?
To British growth for growth, driving economic growth.
Get the full story first on Sky News.
Growth is the #1 mission.
We're trying to see as much as we can.
We start with breaking news. I am Anna Botting.
It's been quite some day.
The golden age of America begins right now.
A long-awaited ceasefire is now underway.
First question, Sky News.
Congratulations, this is a huge moment.
Describe this feeling. It's incredible.
Now to California.
The Democratic mayor of Los Angeles cut the fire department budget.
Do you owe citizens an apology? Have you nothing to say today?
Jane Sacker, Sky News. Would you like to respond to us now?
I've never seen anything like this.
Beth Rigby, Sky News.
In principle, would you agree to do that?
Criticism of you, the president, is banned. How is this a fair election?
Historic day here today.
The cameras are poised here, there, everywhere, waiting to see what the president might do next.
I gave you the A+ treatment. Thank you. Thank you all.
I'm James Matthews, and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world.
I'm Deborah Hames, Sky's security and defence editor. I've covered Russia's full-scale war since it began, witnessing the terror and the trauma.
I'm Stephen Murphy, and I'm Sky's Ireland correspondent based here in Dublin. Sky News, get the full story first.
I'm Martha Kellner, and I'm Sky's US correspondent based here in Los Angeles.
Getting the chance to tell people's stories, it's a privilege. I'm Adam Parsons, Sky's Europe correspondent based here in Brussels.
I'm Dan Whitehead, Sky News' West of England and Wales correspondent. Sky News, get the full story first, free, wherever you get your news.
We are under Israeli military restrictions in terms of some of the things that we can film, but it's important to be in there. What a slow drive for the president as he approaches his golf club. 4 more years! Free wherever you get your news. I'm Mark Stone, and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
We've got your Sunday mornings covered. From the front page and the sounds of the streets to the voices of the people who make the major calls and big picture politics beyond Westminster. We'll put you at the heart of our story.
I'm ready. Are you?
Join me, Trevor Phillips, Sunday mornings on Sky News.
Welcome back. Now, you may remember the case of Belarusian journalist Katerina Andreeva, who was convicted of treason and sentenced to 8 years imprisonment. It was over her work covering the 2020 protest demanding President Alexander Lukashenko resign. Her story is the inspiration for a new film, Under the Grey Sky. Let's just have a look.
Дрон подлетел до окна. Вы его бачили?
Едь дальше. Ты же понимаешь, что по факту он в плену.
Это я. Нас, походу, возьмут.
Малыш, подожди.
Позвони, пожалуйста. Что случилось? Слышь меня, позвони в редакцию и скажи, что я...
Лена! Лена! Меня зовут Ілля Ігоров. Я муж Аліни Антонової, журналістки Белсата, брутально затриманий за стрім з площі Піраміда.
Тримайтеся! Обнимаю вас, родные мои!
У меня ОМОН во дворе. Почистите переписку. Что у нее там происходит?
Ничего.
В каком смысле ничего? Ее перевели в пресс-отряд.
Well, I'm joined here in the studio by the film's director, Mara Tamkovic. Mara, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. I mean, of course, this was inspired by real events, but just tell us a little bit more about, you know, the inspiration behind this, the case itself, and of course, how could we forget the 2020 protests that led to this?
So the film started from the way that the journalist Katerina Andreeva and her camera woman Daria Chultsova were arrested because they were broadcasting from an apartment and they got tracked down by a drone. And then the police forces tried to figure out on which floor they were, and they broke down the wrong door. So, you know, when I heard this happening, it was like, well, that sounds like an absurd American action movie. And this is how I thought about, you know, transforming the experience of the nation that we had back then in 2020 into a film to show how people made certain choices. And then what happened afterwards, so this was developed in a short film, and what happened afterwards to Katerina was the first sentence that seemed outrageous. But then the second one, when she was just about to get out of prison, that was like the world disillusioning around the country, around the people, and around the character. And I wanted to explore that in the film and to see what is there in the humans that makes us hold on. And what I like to add is that, first of all, it's a love story. It's a story about Katerina and her husband, Igor Ilyash, who stayed there in the country for her, despite of all the risks.
Yeah, the risks were huge, actually. And actually, the risks now are something that he faces, because there is a bit of an update on the case. I mean, while she was sentenced to 8 years in prison, he chose to stay in the country and be there for her. What has happened to him?
Well, for the first 2 years, he was constantly harassed and arrested several times with charges and prosecution. But despite that, he remained in the country. Unfortunately, in October 2024, he was arrested again. He's accused of discrediting Republic of Belarus and support of extremist organization, which means, in the minds of Belarusian regime, he gave the interview to foreign journalists. Basically, what we are doing now, right here, this very second, this is what he's facing up to 5 years in prison for.
It's quite extraordinary, actually, because we saw the bravery of so many of those protesters in 2020, and people forget the risks that people take, and whether it's these journalists or whether it's the protesters who were there, families have been destroyed as a result of so many people who were rounded up and sent to prison.
Of course, and also, you know, the world is looking just for this brief, very little moment, and everyone is looking on the protest, but then the cameras turn the other way, and people remain there with the long and painful consequences, and then, you know, something new comes up, and it's not a topic anymore, and those people are still in prison in horrible conditions. And I think it's very important that we have the space, you know, to be mindful about that fact. But, well, politics obviously dominate the conversation about Under the Grey Sky because they are a very strong background of the story. But first of all, it's also, you know, an exploration into what we have as the humans that can help us get through the situations like that. And I think it's a very universal thing that anyone can relate to, whether you know anything about Belarus or even whether you care or not.
Yeah, I have about a minute left, but as you say, it goes back to those deep human emotions and what you would do if democracy, your freedoms, your rights are suddenly taken away from you.
Yes, exactly. And what I try to do is to portray this choice in as human way as possible. My characters are not, you know, these heroes, these monumental heroes. They are very alive, they are very relatable, they are very human, and you can see yourself in them, and you can really feel what would you do in this sort of situation. What would you give up, and what is that thing that you would never give up despite any circumstances?
Yeah, extraordinary. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for
sharing your thoughts. Now, before we go, ever had a bad photo? How about a bad portrait? That's how President Trump felt about this picture that was hanging for years in Colorado's state capitol building. He felt it was purposefully distorted and just the worst. I'll leave you to be the judge of that. But in the end, officials decided to take it down. We'll leave you with this image. Good night.